Hey everybody, welcome back, and I hope that so far you weren't shell-shocked over World War I and you're ready to learn about World War II, because it's going to be a really interesting unit. And today we're going to start talking about one of the most important things, and that's that interwar years, that time between World War I and World War II, and what's going on not only in the United States, but also in the rest of the world that kind of leads to the creation of the problems that we see. So let's go ahead and dive straight in. And first thing is the creation of new governments. So at this time, Europe is changing a lot. You've got the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that is dissolved. You had broken into two countries. You've got the Ottoman Empire that's a host of new countries. And you've got Germany that has changed. And so there's these large-scale government upheavals that happen, and there's very little stability as a result. Russia is one of those in particular. In 1917, they cast out the Tsar and create a provisional government, the Duma, if you remember correctly when we talked about last time, and that they want to create kind of a constitutional democracy to rule the government. The only problem is it doesn't quite work, and they fall to the communist, aka Vladimir Lenin, by 1917, and that's him on the right side. You also get issues in Germany. After the war is over with, they kick out the Kaiser Wilhelm II and they create what's called the Weimar Republic. It's the new government that's in charge, but it's very weak. It's a democratically elected government, but the problem is that Germany has had very little influence or experience in democratic governments over the centuries. So this is a really new and different idea to them. And when political parties start, and one of them being the Nazi Party starts, they really start to vie for power. And there's this whole host of different ideas that come about because of this. And it's going to cause problems for them. Now, most Germans end up blaming the Weimar Republic for kind of what happens after World War I, even though really, as we kind of remember from history, we've talked about, it's really World War I and the Treaty of Versailles that are more to blame, but the people will come to see the Weimar Republic as part of the problem, that they signed off and they gave away too much in hopes of avoiding being conquered by the Allies. Now, we also have in Germany the rise of inflation, and inflation just generally means the rise of prices. For instance, in 1918, a loaf of bread costs less than 1 mark, but by 1916, it's 1922 rather, it's 160 marks, and by 1923, it's over 2 billion marks. So things are changing very, very quickly, and people can't keep up. Money basically becomes worthless after a while, and most people use it as kindling for their fire, or in this case, where you see on the photo here, kids use it as building blocks. They bundle all the money together and use it. Many of you have seen that famous photo before of a gentleman with a wheelbarrow picking up his paycheck, right, and getting his marks in a wheelbarrow because it takes that much money to pay him off, right? You do get attempts at peace, and in 1924, Germany and France finally try to bury the hatchet once and for all, and they agree to never fight again. But, hey, guess what's going to happen? They're going to fight again when Hitler comes along, right? Germany also agrees in 1924 to respect the new borders that were drawn, with Poland being created and the Rhineland and parts of Czechoslovakia being taken away, or parts of the Sudetenland, rather, being taken away to create Czechoslovakia. They also agree to join the League of Nations, which is a big deal. Remember, the League of Nations is that group that's going to try to bring people together and resolve their conflicts. It doesn't last long, and mainly it's because the United States is not involved still. What else is going on? Well, it's not just all new governments and peace, but it's also kind of financial issues, and that's really the core of what's going on in Europe and around the world at this time. The financial collapses characterize and plague the 1920s and 30s. Particularly in America, but also they hit especially hard in places like Germany. But in the United States, there's the economy is strong, but there are a few weaknesses. One is overproduction, and that's a big one. If you're making a lot of stuff that you don't really need, eventually it's going to be hard to sell all those items. Two, there's an uneven distribution of wealth. There's the incredibly rich and pretty much everybody else. And we'll talk about that when you see kind of by 1929, the richest 5% have about 33% of the world's wealth. I mean, think about that for a minute. 33% of the world's wealth is contained with just 5% of the population. You also begin to have Americans buying less. Once the World War I ends and there's this glut of buying products, eventually that buying and that good time starts to wear off. And by the 1930s, people are really upside down in their products, meaning they've made these products, but they're no longer as profitable to make as they used to be. And in some cases, they're selling them for so cheap, they're not even making a profit. Now, Here's kind of a way to think about this. And this is a bit of like a flow chart for this. So the results of the problems equal overproduction. That's kind of where the crux of all of this happens. If you are making too many crops and you're unable to sell those crops, then as a farmer, for instance, you can't pay your loans. If you can't pay your loans, then the bank starts to weaken because they don't have money and cash on hand to be able to give to other people to help them out. If the banks weaken, then they close. And when they close, people lose millions. And we talked about, if you remember from our American economics unit, people go from being super wealthy to living on the street in overnight almost. They lose millions upon millions of dollars. You also have the stock market crash of 1929. This is kind of the thing that kicks it all off and really gets people freaking out and gets the depression rolling, right? So by 1929, the United States had become kind of the economic capital of the world. After World War I, while most of Europe is rebuilding, the United States is relatively safe and has not had any fighting. So they can just become this economic powerhouse. But by September of 29, investors begin to see that stocks are getting too high and they start to worry and they start selling them off very, very quickly. October 4th, prices fall, panic ensues, collapse happens, and you get Black Tuesday, which ushers in kind of the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, a depression, if you remember, is a severe economic slump that followed the collapse of the U.S. stock market crash in 1929. And by 1933, over a quarter of all American workers were unemployed. I mean, think about that. In that terms today, that would be like if we had 100 million people, that's 25 million people without a job. So people are very destitute and very poor. But the depression doesn't just hit the United States, it hits globally as well, as Americans begin to demand repayment from Europe for the loans that they'd given them. See, after the war, when most of Europe is rebuilding, like France and Germany and Great Britain, they're rebuilding their countries, they borrow money from American lenders. And as the economy becomes more unstable, the American lenders are a little concerned that they're not going to be able to get the money that they had loaned out. So they start demanding repayment of the loans. When they do that, they pull their money from Europe. Europe begins to collapse itself. And it's particularly harsh for Germany and Austria. They suffer very, very hard without the U.S. money and without U.S. involvement. Now, eventually we will elect this guy right here, Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he'll bring along what's called the New Deal in America. And he's pretty confident about the New Deal. He's pretty sure it's going to work. And eventually it will, in conjunction with World War II and the kind of the stimulus that happens from building planes and tanks and weapons and things like that. But for the New Deal itself, or just kind of a refresher, he has 5 goals in particular. One is the 3 R's, that relief, recovery, and reform. Number 2 is that public works projects like TVA, where he's going to dam the Tennessee River and create hydroelectric power for millions of people. Number 3 is new government agencies are created, and they help kind of rebound the financial district. Number 4, wealth and reform programs to kind of put people back to work and get them back on their feet again. And finally, remember, he's going to close the banks and kind of have those stock market and banking regulations put into place so that hopefully we'll avoid ever having this again. And luckily, we've avoided a depression. We just came out of a Great Recession, but we've never had another depression. And some of it is because of the programs that still have a lasting impact from way back in the 1930s and 40s. Now, if you really want to think of an easy way to try to remember the global economic impact of the Great Depression, it comes down to crash. And if you remember from World War I really love my acronyms like MANIA and BRAT. So here's a really great way to think about the pre-World War II kind of economic Europe and what happens, how come it's so bad. So for instance, for one, credit expands, that's your C, right? And it's brought in, people buy goods that they just really couldn't afford. That happens mainly in the United States, but it also happens around the world. People are buying things, they're putting it on credit, kind of the precursor to credit cards, right? And then it's hard for them to pay it off later on when they have no money. Number 2 is reparations, and that goes back to the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Germany was told to pay those reparations in excess of $33 billion. And once that money is taken away from them, the U.S. investment money, then they not only do they have a Great Depression, but they also then any money that they do make is immediately going to pay those reparations. So it digs them into a deeper and deeper hole. Number 3 is American industry being too dominant. After the war, remember, America is one of the only places in the world that's not rebuilding. And so they just begin to pump out goods and services. As a result, Europe becomes way too dependent on those goods. And when they can't have them anymore, it's going to create a void for Europe, and it's going to create more strife and more problems. Number 4 is the crash of the stock market in 1929. The U.S. stocks crashed, businesses and banks closed, people are hit hard, they're unemployed. No work means no money means no food means, well, you can put the pictures together there and figure it out yourself. And finally, H, high profit protective tariffs. See, the United States was really worried that once Europe got on its feet, they would try to start selling goods in the United States, and that would damage American markets. So to protect them, they create tariffs. A tariff is basically a tax on imported goods. Now, America is going to create really high tariffs to kind of not really dissuade, but more to protect the American industry. But the problem is that once the rest of the world does get on its feet, it's very difficult for them to sell things to the new big market of the United States. And so then as a result, people really struggle to get back on their feet. So if you look at crash and you look at kind of all of these ways and you think about it within the context of what is happening within Europe and the United States in pre-World War II, you can begin to see that all of this struggle, all this pain, all this suffering is going to open the door to brutal fascist dictators like Mussolini, like Adolf Hitler, like Tojo in Japan, and we'll begin to see how the world is taking ever greater steps to World War II. We'll do that in our next video. Otherwise, make sure you have these items in your notes. We'll talk about them tomorrow in class, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.